Hey all, welcome back to the drawing studio in Brattleboro, Vermont. This is the second installment of the color mixing for painters tutorial. Okay, so just by way of review, so that we can re-familiarize ourselves with the common vocabulary that we're using. We have been working with a 6-part color wheel, which is made up of the primary color triad of yellow, red, and blue, and then the secondary color triad of green, orange, and violet. We have this set up in a wheel because it shows, one of the reasons we have it set up in a wheel is because it shows the continuity of color, that these colors borrow from and graduate one into the other continuously, so that yellow, as it moves toward blue, starts to partake of blue and it creates green. So the secondary colors are of course made up from the interaction of the primary colors. Okay, so we're using this very basic format because we want to learn, well, we want to learn the basics of color theory, and we also want to learn to mix color from life, like from scratch, from very basic ingredients, how to find something very subtle from the most basic sources. Okay, so our terms that we introduced last segment, the first one was hue. What hue means basically is, y'all see that? What hue means basically is what is the native color family that we're talking about? Like what is its name? So yellow, blue, orange. Hue basically means like what color family are we talking about? Okay. Temperature is the scale of the relative warmth or coolness of any given color. So in the color wheel, this hemisphere is the warm hemisphere. This hemisphere is the cool hemisphere. Now all of these terms are relative to the context. Our context here is this 6-part color wheel. So these guys are the warm ones, these ones are the cool ones. Okay, so that's temperature, the warmth or coolness of a color. Value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. That just means like if you would imagine any color existing on a grayscale from white to black with all of the shades of gray in between, which value, which area would that color's value be? Like where would it fall on a black and white setting along that grayscale? So every color has an internal value, meaning an internal lightness or darkness that has nothing to do with the hue, right? So value is, value is independent from hue. That's important. So that's value, the scale of light to dark of any given color. And then saturation is what is the relative intensity or neutrality, like subtleness or subdual of a color? So you could imagine in the family of red, you could imagine fire engine red, and then, gosh, like we used last time, we used like a brick red. They're both clearly coming from the red family, but one is much closer to home and the other's been out mixed up with other things a lot more, so it's less nameable. You can still trace it back to that origin color, but it's had other influences along the way, so it's different. So that's saturation, their scale of intensity to neutrality of any given color. Okay, so those are our terms. And those 4 categories are going to provide a framework for us to understand basic color theory. Well, they are basic color theory, but they'll provide a framework for us to mix color from life with reliability and assurance and enjoyment. Cool. So what I want to introduce today is complementary colors, what happens with them, and how to start physically mixing the paint in ways that will then encounter colors that we see in the world. So complementary colors are colors that are opposite on the color wheel. So there's 3, in the 6-part color wheel, there's 3 complementary pairs. There's red and green, there's violet and yellow, and there's orange and blue. Now to review, one of the things that's so interesting to me about complementary colors is that they, as a pairing, they complete each other. They provide what was missing. That's the complement part. They provide what was missing. So every complementary pair is made up of a primary color, in this case blue, meeting a secondary color, which is made of the 2 remaining primaries. So every complementary pair is effectively the 3 primary colors re-meeting each other. Okay. one of the things that's interesting to see is because complementary colors intensify each other when they're proximal, when they're near each other, you can see that like red and green, purple and yellow, like Easter, today is Easter, by the way, these like holiday pairings in blue and orange or black and orange, they're like what we're familiar with holidays. Like they're very attention getting. So red and green with Christmas, like boom, like those colors together wake each other up a lot. The red looks more red next to a green, the yellow looks more yellow next to a purple, and that's because they have no chromatic overlap. They don't know anything about each other. They have nothing in common, we'll say. Not that they don't know about each other, but they have nothing in common. So the yellow gets together with purple is really getting together with the two other first arrivals of color, red and blue, and they have no chromatic overlap. There's nothing about them that's common, and so that they don't vouch for each other. They're just distinct from each other, which introduces a lot of really cool qualities. So that's thing one about complementary colors, is that they intensify each other when they're proximal, when they're near each other. The second one is what we're going to be getting into today, which is when they get mixed together physically, they start to introduce the whole range of earth tones that we encounter in the world. Okay, so physical mixing of color. If you don't know about color mixing, or you don't like it, or you're not familiar with it, it can seem like a necessary evil, like something like a means to an end. You just got to get through it so you can get to the part you want to get to, the painting maybe. But really, color mixing is a part of painting. You're warming up to the materials, you're getting to know them, they're getting to know you. One of the things that's really cool is that it gives you an opportunity to become sensitive to what the communication of a color is, independent of its object reference. Like if I know I'm painting a barn, outside, and I say, oh, I have to get that red right. If I'm so oriented on that barn, I don't even really see what's happening with the red in terms of its own basic communication, its own quality of feeling along the way until it gets to the barn. So the more we slow down and let color mixing be like a valid dimension of painting, the more we'll start to become personally connected, sensitive to the communication of color, independent of object reference. So I hope that makes sense. It's really important. And the more I learned about these simple things about color mixing, the more that level of appreciation woke up. And then that moves into your painting in a way where you're not using color, hey, just look like that barn, that's all I want from you, right? It's not, there's a lot more that's possible in terms of your relationship to it, obviously. So that's one good reason to not treat color mixing as a means to an end. It of course is that, but if we bring our attention back further, it really is a part of painting. And the more we treat it like that, the more the colors will warm up to us and we'll have actually more intelligence about painting. Okay. So what I want to do is choose a complementary pair, and then we're going to introduce the physical mixing of paint. So I don't have any camera editing skills, so I'm not going to do zooms and all that stuff. So this is our format, and we'll just go with it. I think I'm going to choose blue and orange. Oh, and also I brought white onto our palette today. This is a zinc white, not titanium white, which I thought I was going to use, but a zinc white, which we'll be using a little bit later. But for now, I want to deal with a complementary pairing of orange and blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some orange here and take some blue and put it down here. So everybody can see that, good. And here's our rag. Now you can experiment with palette knives. I really like these guys. I'm not sure well, this is a Creative Mark number T3, but I like it because it's got a rounded edge on it and it has spring, so it has flexibility. And when I'm physically handling paint, this might be helpful to you. I don't put the blade flat on the palette. If I put it flat on the palette, the paint starts to creep up along the neck of the thing. It gets more unruly, it spreads out. If you use the palette knife at say a 30-degree angle and use the spring of it, I'll bring this up closer. This is our zoom. Right. If you use it on an angle, you can corral the paint, you can mix it around, it becomes more, I don't know, you can just handle it better, especially if you're working in a tighter space. So you'll experiment, but you'll get more familiar with the mixing part of it, and that becomes a lot more enjoyable as you do. So I set up the orange and the blue with some distance away from each other, because what I want to do now is I want to mix them together and create a bridge going all the way across, basically transitioning one color into the other in a relatively seamless way. So as a general rule of thumb, I would say it's better to add dark to light as you're mixing, or, this is a trickier one, or add a strong pigment to a weak pigment as you're mixing, for this purpose of creating scales in complementary colors or in value structure, which we'll be doing later. The reason for that is, well, let's just say it's a rule. I won't get into the reason yet, but let's just say it's helpful. So either adding dark to light as you go, which means starting from light and then moving along toward dark, adding dark as you go. Or if you know between two pigments, red and green for instance, I know just from familiarity that this cadmium red deep is a lot stronger than this sap green. So I'm going to start with the sap green and then add red to it as I go. And really the simple reason is that if you go in the other direction, if I add weak to strong, it's going to take a whole lot of green to budge that red at all. If I add, like between purple and yellow, if I start at purple, I'm going to have to add a whole lot of yellow initially to get that purple to move. So in a way, it's easier to influence if you're adding strong to weak or adding dark to light. Okay, so in this case, orange and blue, we're going to start with orange. Now, if you think of the analogy of like walking a path and leaving a trail, like a trail of breadcrumbs or footsteps, it's a very helpful analogy. So we're starting with orange, that's home base, but we want to walk with measured steps toward blue. So I want to make sure you can see this well. There we go. Hold on. A little closer. Okay, got that. So we have our orange. What I've done, now this is really important, all right? So just do it like this. If you're doing these physically, these exercises, just do it like this. And then once you've learned how to do this, you can do it any way that makes sense to you. But this really will iron out a lot of trouble. You'll avoid a lot of confusion if you just sort of just adopt this for the time being until we get to know this stuff better. So we started at orange, and what I did was I moved a portion of orange down the line. So that's the first step, boom. And what I do then is I add a little bit of blue to it. And we want to mix, for our purposes, for these learning purposes, we want to mix the paint thoroughly, like so that it becomes a completely new, homogenized, coherent other color. We don't want veins of orange or blue still running through it. We want it mixed thoroughly. Now what you can see, I think you can see that. You can see that this is darkened up a little bit. What I'd like to do is introduce intervals, meaning like distance of steps between them so that I can get from orange to blue in about 10 steps. So that little footstep is maybe too short for me to cover that distance. So if I wanted to get there in 100 steps, or 50 steps, then I could make these increments very small and just go all the way. But for our purposes, I want to move it along with longer strides, you could say. Now this one, I oversteered a little bit. I think it's too big a step and it's just too big a jump. So what I can do is just bring a little more orange into it. And I'm actually going to get more orange because that feels like too big a step to me. Okay, so cadmium orange hue. When you're mixing color, this is really going to be helpful to you, I think, is don't mix color like in a stingy way. Mix a little bit more than you think you need. Like mix with more sense of abundance. One of the most discouraging things in painting is if you just have too little of a quantity, you're going to end up asking it to just cover more ground than it should. It's going to run into the sand. It's going to feel depleted. So if you get in the habit of mixing color more generously, then you'll get a feel for the physical body of oil paint. You'll get a feel for, and also you won't have to add such tiny increments to change it. You can add more robustly. And you end up, if you're actually painting and not doing a color mixing exercise, if you're actually painting, you end up with larger quantities of what you need, and you end up with larger footprints along the way that might become useful in other areas. So these student or one above student grade paints are really good because you don't have to worry in the same way about cost or quantity. So my advice is to just mix more generously, and you'll be better off. You'll develop a better relationship with oil paint. Okay, so there's our first step. Now that feels like a decent interval. What I'm going to do now is I want to leave a sizable footprint of that behind, because in the end I'm going to mark on this the whole bridge, the whole range of colors from orange to blue. So this is important. We took one footstep, mixed it homogeneously, and then gauge the interval, gauge the distance between the orange and its first step away from orange toward blue. And once that footstep seems pretty good, then we take some of that quantity and move it down the line, and we add a little more blue to it. Some people will do I'll mix half blue and half orange and find the middle. I've seen that be more confusing than helpful, so I would recommend just sticking with this approach. The other thing that's really cool is that you're doing a few things. You're physically learning how to handle the tools and the material, which is really important. The other thing is that you're tuning your eye to gauging distances, like gauging color distances, like how far along does this much pigment move that color. So that's a really helpful thing, because that's what you're going to be doing in painting a lot, is just adjusting colors in big or in subtle ways. And then the other thing you're doing is you're getting to know how strong or weak certain pigments are. So as we add color, it's good to add a little bit, then add a little bit more, because you can always add more, but you can't, if you add too much, you can't take it away, right? So if you overshoot it and you make a giant step by adding too much blue in this case, the only thing you could do is scrape it out, put it off to the side, and maybe it'll fit in later, but you'd have to remix that step. So as a general rule, I would say you can always add more, so don't overstate it. Now, this is important. We've got 3 steps now. We've got 1, 2, 3. And what we can do is sort of gauge, do they feel like they share an interval? Like, are they walking with a similar measured stride as they go? So we don't want a little step, then a big jump, then a little, then something. We want them to be really measured. And that's part of the discipline we can develop in terms of just getting to know how to do this stuff reliably. So those steps feel pretty good to me. Now I'm going to move it along a little faster, but you get the idea. So importantly, I leave a good enough footprint behind that I can make a note, a color note on this page, on this board afterward. When you're painting, you may want to leave larger footprints, larger quantities of color behind, because those might be exactly what you need for some other area of the picture, and they give you quantities of paint that you can then diversify. You can break some off and add some blue or some white or whatever you want, but it gives you a lot of mobility. So for our purposes, I'm just leaving enough to make a note at the end, but you don't want to mix in a stingy way. Give yourself enough to work with. Okay, so I moved some of that down the line. I left a footprint behind. I add the blue. And now we're encountering colors that we actually see in the world, right? This looks a lot like the floorboards, or the darker parts of the floorboards here in the studio. One of the cool things is that this is almost like, what do you call it? Like backward engineering something? Reverse engineering, that's what they call it. So now when we encounter this color in the world, this one, we can say, oh yeah, that comes from orange, mostly. That's its hue, right? That's its native hue, its dominant color family. But then it's been mixed up with blue, right? So we'll be able to discern within a very complicated color that doesn't really have its own name exactly what made it. That's a very good skill to have. All right, so there's our 4th step. I leave a footprint behind. The good thing too is that if you screw up, you're only screwing up in 1 or 2 directions, you know? It's not like you have no idea what went wrong. Like if something goes wrong, it's probably because you added too much of this or too little. So it's easier to correct. So I'm getting good steps now. And just to show, I'll do one more step and then I'll show you something cool. At a certain point, it's going to achieve a middle state. It's going to be some color that really, right now I would say it still belongs primarily to orange, but soon it won't. Soon it'll be somewhere where you're like, that's not being pulled on by either parent, you know, that's really like its own new thing. It's like right in the middle. So check this out. So this now, if we put this up next to orange, like look how different it is. But really, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 5 steps away, little steps actually, from orange going toward blue. Now I'm going to wind this out a little bit so I have room to complete it. Now what will happen with you maybe, which is what's happening with me, is that I'm kind of running into the sand where I didn't give myself enough quantity. So it's running a little low. I might be able to make it around to blue. But if I felt like I was just like getting depleted, then it's not a hard thing to say, oh, I'll just take some blue and some orange and remix this color. It's like refueling, right? We just stop there and say, well, let's make some more of that, which is actually what I'll do right now just to demonstrate. So I want to make more of this color. So I take some orange, some blue, and I have that right next to it as a reference point. And then it's just a simple thing of tuning it. And you want to mix this stuff thoroughly so that, there we go, that's really close. You want to mix it thoroughly so that you don't have veins of orange or blue running through and distorting your perception. You really want a homogeneous mix. That's not necessarily how you might want to paint in the end. You might, you might want things that are more organic or varied or whatever it is. But for our purposes of learning and perceiving, you want a thorough mix so that it becomes a single new undifferentiated color. Okay, so then once we've got them both and they're the same, we add them together and we've reintroduced quantity. All right, so there's our step. Another footprint, I leave some behind. I walk the rest of it down the line. Add some more blue. Now we're getting somewhere. Now I would say it's not quite, it's almost greenish, which makes sense color theory wise because the orange is red and yellow. So now the green quality of this might be starting to emerge. But I can't say it's overly influenced by either parent color now. It's really in the middle, but it's starting to tip toward blue. Move some down the line, leave a footprint behind, super important. And then it gets into this beautiful range of colors, like almost getting towards slate, but it reminds me of like a bank, like a muddy bank in in the spring when it's like all funky and dark and like a bank like on a river. All like, just like composting, decomposing matter. All right, so there's that one. So I'm going to move these more quickly toward the blue to resolve this scale. And you'll be able to see, like right there, that's a little bit of an overstep. So I can just go back and add a little more orange to reel it back in to make the interval more measured, more in keeping with what came before. So you can develop a lot of skill, like applied perception, right? Like you see the thing and then you're like, oh, I know how to adjust that so that it's more true. That's a great capacity to develop. And all along the way, our hand is getting to know this palette knife, our eyes are getting to know these pigments, we're learning a lot. And your shoulder's getting wicked tired, all that. And here they start to get in these like really deep tones that it's funny because then you'll recognize like, oh, that's like the color of whatever it is, you know, a certain quality of night or like hills in the distance at night. You'll see things you like, so that's how it's made. It's actually only two things. It's cadmium orange and it's ultramarine blue. So that reverse engineering part of it, or like my mom is a really good cook and she can like taste food and then figure out all the ingredients that were in it. It's the same thing with color mixing. You encounter a color in the world and you're like, I know mostly where that came from, or I can find it once I get into it. Okay, I think we've got our scale. Cool. All right, so we've got, let's check this out. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 running the scale from orange to blue. Now what I want to do is I want to transfer them, and this will be really helpful for you to do with all of the complementary pairs, is to create basically a scale going across, spanning the two color families. Let me flip this over. And this is important, you don't want to put any color, any of these mixes on your board until you've got the whole run of them established on the palette like this. And they all feel true and measured and like the, you know, it feels right. And then you have these quantities that you can then apply here. So I'm going to make a little run. I'll make it over here. So here's number 1. And I would say pull them out so they're flat. Like, don't leave big ridges. One thing that's good is you pull them flat, it'll dry faster, right? So it won't get messy. Also, it gives you an uninterrupted view of the color. Ridges create light and shadow, and it's more distracting. So cleaning your palette knife between applications is really important so you don't contaminate the color. So we end up with these really good clean samples. 1, 2, 3, 4. And here it'll be easier to see, you know, if I've misstepped 1, 2, 3, 4, or taken too big a step or too little, whatever it is. But so far so good. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one's going to turn the corner on this board. Well, look at that color, right? That's a really cool color, that last dark one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. We turn the corner, getting into the darker territory. Got a few more steps to get around the bend. And then one more, and we arrive at ultramarine blue. So that feels like too big a step. I don't know if you can see it well with this lighting, but it feels like a jump from that to ultramarine blue. So I would actually, I'm going to do it right here. I would mix that, I would neutralize it a little bit with its previous color, its neighbor from before, just because I want the run to be more fluid, more measured. Okay, so we've got that guy, and now ultramarine blue steps in, and it's not so jarring. So let's check this out. So we've got the run all the way, about 14, 15 colors in between. So my recommendation is to give yourself time to do this with every complementary pair. As you do, all these things will start, these capacities will start to develop. Your physical color mixing, your perception, your knowledge about the particular pigments that you're using, and what you'll find is in the middle, Like if red and green were to get together, you'd find in their middle transitional territory, they share a lot of qualities with the middle transitional territory between orange and blue, which makes complete sense in terms of color theory because it's the same three coming together. But you'll start to become very sensitive to these neutral, earthy gray tones and understand like where they come from. Okay, cool. So that's what we'll do for today. I did the one complementary pair, but I would encourage you to do all three complementary pairs, and then you've really covered that ground. And what we'll do next time is talk about tertiary colors, which are third string colors, what happens in between a primary and a secondary. Like between red and orange, you would have some other color that was a reddish orange, but it would really exist right in the middle between those two. And I also want to introduce value structure, like the relative lightness or darkness of any given color. Great. Thank you. I'm Jason Alden. This is the Drawing Studio, and this is part 2 of our Color Mixing for Painters tutorial. Thanks for joining.